Hello and welcome to On the Mark Financial Literacy with Mark Zinman. We have Alicia with us today as well as Mark. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. So today we are going to be exploring how couples with different spending habits and different financial goals can manage their money together. Yes?
Very interesting and very important subject. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about why this subject is so important. Why are we discussing this topic today?
Well, for two main reasons. Number one is I believe that couples who are going to start living together or sharing finances don't discuss in advance that as much as they might discuss maybe children and religion and other things. And I think that it's a very important topic. And I think that if you, I know that if you look up, because I did it already, if you look up the chief causes of divorce, financial issues is one of them. So, and I would say that, we've discussed before that there is very few people that have more money than they think they need to spend. So it's always going to be a challenge on allocation. And when there's more than one person, then obviously you have to figure out how you're going to handle it.
Mm-hmm. And piggybacking on that, through my educational journey, I have also been taught that another reason that relationships suffer, be them professional or in this case personal, is due to misaligned expectations. And misaligned expectations as it relates to the management or mismanagement of household funds could certainly cause that conflict that you're talking about.
Which is why it has to be a conversation before you get together, and you have to have a methodology of having ongoing conversations once you're together. And I'll usually, I don't want to be like, let's just say you got married, okay? It's just easier to pick a term here. So once you get married, you're going to constantly have financial things that you didn't expect, and you'll have to figure out how you're going to make the choices that you both can live with and won't resent the other one over or won't feel lacking.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then before we started recording today's episode, you and I had a very brief chit chat, and I shared some things that I hope that you might educate people on. And I would like to throw my first question to you, with it being one that I did not mention when we briefly chit chatted a moment ago. And that is, could we, and perhaps in the future we devote an entire episode to this topic, but something that you said made me think of prenups. So when we talk about misaligned expectations and managing money differently, do you want to speak today a little bit about why a couple might execute upon a prenup? Because you're talking about having these conversations before you move in together or before there is a legally binding relationship such as a marriage. Would you like to talk about a prenup being part of that communication?
Sure, certainly. I think that if you're very young and you really have very similar assets, then a prenup isn't necessarily as important. But if you're especially a second marriage, or if somebody comes into a marriage substantially, if Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, right? They both are fairly wealthy people, but I'm assuming that they will get a prenup, only because that would be the best thing. Money is a very powerful tool, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a motivation. So I think that you should have a discussion about what your expectations are. Again, all the stuff is, stuff that you should talk about, because we don't want to find out later, you don't want to find out later that you wanted 6 children and your spouse wanted 0, and you didn't discuss it before you get married. So you don't want to find out these financial things either. So yes, is a prenup is I see prenup a lot more in second marriage, and you see completely different money management styles. Sometimes it's done by a prenup in second marriages. Sometimes it's done by designating beneficiaries. So like you would not have your second spouse be the beneficiary of your retirement account, but maybe your children. And it's a way of splitting up the money. And as long as it's open and honest with everyone, and to the extent that you need it documented in a legal document, that, I've said this on other episodes too, you have to imagine almost every day this is your last day on earth. And I say it not to be morbid, but that everything will flow without conflict and the way you want if you're not here tomorrow.
So thank you for that. And that's a good segue into what I would like to ask you next, which is some couples define what having a comfortable amount of disposable or discretionary income means to them. Some people, perhaps due to some influences, some experiences earlier in life, they have perhaps went through a period of insecurity. Perhaps they're still going through that. And different people have different levels of what makes them feel comfortable. So how might couples explore how each was taught about money management and their financial habits and what having money means to them? How do they have that open dialogue?
I don't know how you have the open dialogue. You have to have the open dialogue because in reality, and I think most people who are married who are listening here have gotten an under the hood view of their spouse's family, and you're going to immediately notice differences in attitudes. It doesn't have to always be financial, but it's just going to be different, maybe different interactions between the family members than you're used to. And so you sort of have to adopt what's best for you and your spouse. And everybody's going to come from a different place. So if there was a certain challenge in your past, like, my wife was always told to have her own money. And so we found a way to have her own, it's not whatever, but she always just feels like if something happened, and even though we're married almost 40 years, if something happens, she has her own money, whatever that means to her. And we are addressing that situation so she doesn't feel challenged. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, you brought up the question about how to spend the money. Well, first of all, and we talked about this in an earlier episode, you should have a budget. Everyone should have some type of a budget, especially if you're younger. I think that money becomes a much more of a financial burden to people that are under the age of 50. And why I say that is because normally that would be the years in which you are accumulating wealth, maybe buying your house and paying it down, putting money in your retirement account, whatever. And at the same time, you have a large expense for your children to get to emancipation. And that's part of a discussion that has to happen as well, is what does emancipation of your children mean? Does it mean paying for college, not paying for college, paying for grad school, not paying for grad school?
Right.
18, 22. You have to have all these discussions, and they can evolve out. But a lot of times what I've seen is it's influenced by what happened to them. If your parents paid for college, you want to pay for college. If your parents said you're done at 18, take student loans out, and you suffered, it's I walk 6 blocks to school in the snow uphill each way, and then you want your children to do the same thing. So you're going to come from those different, exactly what you said before, you're going to come with those different factors.
Right. So I might ask you where I was going with this. Tell me if you would agree or disagree with this. Okay. I find that, and I'll give you an example of why I might suggest this. I find that sometimes when you're having a conversation about something that is sensitive, such as money, if you provide context, if you provide an explanation as to why you're saying what you're saying, there is perhaps a greater likelihood that the person that you're speaking with will understand your perspective and not discount it if they happen to intuitively disagree with it. I'm going to give you an example. So we work together, and I will make a purchase for the company. And you have at times, before we started using Ramp, you, as we discussed in a previous episode, you have sent me an email saying, what is this for? I knew why you were asking that question because you needed to properly categorize it in the books. We'll put it that way. I knew why you were asking. So I fired back with the answer because I understood the context by which you were asking the question. If I did not understand that we needed to know how to categorize that expense, I might have been defensive and felt like, well, what do you mean? What did I buy this for? You blah, 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 and I would feel defensive. So we want to kind of, if we're having an open communication, try to minimize the amount of times that someone their go-to reaction might be to feel defensive by providing context. For example, throughout my youth, I'm not talking about myself, I'm just saying generally, throughout my youth, I had food insecurity. And as a consequence of that, it's very important to us that we X. And then if that X is having more money than one might want, liquid available in your checking account, then the other spouse might understand that maybe logically it's not needed, but emotionally it's needed or mentally it's needed. And that's more important. That supersedes, right? So would you agree that maybe providing some reasons why, if you disagree, might not be helpful in having a conversation that's more productive and makes all parties agree at the end?
I think that money is a much more emotional topic than people realize until they're in it. And I see it in my practice. I make this joke. The old H&R Block commercial was, we got Mary Smith $2,500 back. And I tend to be judged on, I'm a wonderful accountant if you walk out with a refund, and I'm a dog if you walk out owing. And the actual answer is, well, you get a refund because you paid too much in, and you owe money because you paid too little in. But yet that is an emotional component. We addressed that emotional component when we talked about businesses when they're taking money out of a business account, how to put away money for taxes, because we don't want them to think it's their money, because nobody wants to reach back into their pocket to pay for something they already thought they maybe paid for and don't realize they hadn't. Money's very emotional. So the things that you're talking about, and we could probably have an hour's worth of listing out events that's happened in people's lives that influence their perception of money. And two people who are getting together who didn't have the same parents are going to have different perceptions of money. And you have to work out your shorthand. So yes, we have a shorthand where if you went and did something that wasn't obvious to me, I don't rate when you put gas in the company car, because it says, I know you're getting gasoline because it mentions a gas station. But if you went to Amazon and bought a bunch of stuff for the office, I wouldn't know what it was without seeing a receipt. So I would ask you so I could properly categorize it. I have the same issue with my wife. We manage our money by, I pay, and that's another thing to understand. Normally in a relationship, one person is more the financial partner. It's usually never 50-50. It's usually one spouse takes control of the finances. It doesn't mean the other one isn't informed. It's just that you don't need two people to do one job as long as you have an understanding. In my family, I guess because I'm the accountant, it fell to me. So I pay the family bills, and I do most of my stuff online. And my wife has a checkbook and a credit card, and she can do whatever she wants on a check, writing a check or having a credit card. And I'll ask her at times what something is, because I just don't know who the payee is. And it's not an argument, but we have the shorthand. She doesn't feel like it's the same thing you say. We've worked out where she doesn't feel like I say, like, well, what was $200 at ABC? What do you mean, what was $200? No, she would say to me, oh, remember I did this or I did that. And, there's no emotion in that, because I understand that I'm asking her a question. She's responding. It doesn't mean that she did something out of context of what our agreement was.
So the thought here is for us to understand and really respect that financial conversations are very emotionally driven. They are driven by a person's unique history and experiences. And so with our partner, someone that we love, we want to be generous in thought and communication. And if they want to do differs from what we want to do, we will assume, if we're being generous in our thought and communication, that there is a very real reason why that is, and want to have that open dialogue. To that end.
And adjust your perception. I mean, like,
yes.
in my own personal life, I'm very pragmatic. Like, my wife wants to change the lights that are over the sink, right? They still go on. What's wrong with them? Okay. But she wants a different style. So you have to sort of figure out that that's something she needs. And I have to get to a point where I'm comfortable and we have an understanding. And she wants to buy a new kitchen table because she's tired of the one we have. Well, I still eat dinner on it every day. It's fine for me. But, it's weird, and the funny thing, I'll give you a funny one. So throughout my life, when I put my foot down and say we're not going to do it, it absolutely means we're going to do it. Okay. So everybody knows, and I guess they had, there's a saying that happy wife, happy life. Well, it's happy spouse, happy life. So, and that fits certainly into the conversation about money.
Right. And even just professionally as well, because, some of your viewers and listeners are thinking at this and thinking about their personal finances and also as a business owner. So again, I'll talk about conversations that you and I have had. And what this comes down to, if we want to just throw a little bit of terminology, is how risk adverse an individual or a partner is. For example, years ago, you and I had a dialogue as to how much cash we wanted to keep in the business to cover payroll for how many months or years. And I wanted to cover a longer period of time, cash in the bank, to cover expenses than you did. And you, as the accountant, expressed that I was wanting to keep too much. And I was explaining to you that because I'm more risk adverse than you are, this would make me feel more comfortable. And you said, okay, so perhaps the business decision would have been different, but you accommodated what was my anxiety, is that I had a responsibility to members of the team, and I was much more risk adverse than you were. And so perhaps we you accommodated what was a concern to me emotionally. And so that's what we're talking about when we're also dealing with partners.
And you bring up another good thing. Having a partner or somebody at work is just like having, they call it work wife, work husband, work spouse. It's the same thing. I mean, what's a conflict that occurs in a lot of partnerships or money? It's the same thing that happens personally. You have to sort of, develop your own style of what you're going to do. And I just want to give a couple examples of some of the styles I've seen.
Please.
And it's a comfort. So I know people, and the thing that's most interesting, because people explain to me how they manage their money, is there is no right way and there is no consistent way. Okay. Everybody has a little variation. And I don't necessarily think it's something they copied from their parents. I don't think most parents are as open to sharing how they manage money, maybe a little bit. And I'm not saying they should be. I mean, the financial literacy of understanding things about money, which is, the core value of this podcast, is certainly something, but you have to do what's comfortable for you. So I know, like, for example, my son and his wife, they contribute a certain amount of their paycheck to the joint account, and the rest goes into a personal account, and they can spend whatever they want out of their personal account, and the joint account is what handles the expenses, and they have their methodology, I guess, of how they are going to handle emergencies. Okay. Older people, and I say older people who get married later in life, second marriages, who may already have children, a lot of times they don't always share joint accounts, but I pay the mortgage, you pay the food. I pay for the shore house, you pay for the regular house. And they find their way of dividing it up in a way that they feel comfortable, and they still have, quote unquote, their own money.
Let me interrupt you there, because we do have a question from Angie from Philadelphia.
Okay.
Angie asks you, what are some strategies I can use to figure out how to fairly share expenses? One of us earns significantly more income than the other. So I'm kind of piggybacking on your saying with a marriage later in life or with a second marriage, there might not be a joint account. So let's explore that further, but perhaps at the same time, you could also answer Angie's question.
So it's an interesting question, because it depends. I mean, and I'm saying it depends because you may be a 35-year-old person where you've elected that one spouse will spend more time with the children and maybe not work as much, and that could be a disparity of your income. You may also just have something in later in life, like you said, where you might have a significant income variation. You're going to have to talk it out. I mean, there's, in his case, I'm not exactly sure if it's a situation where, one person makes a lot more than the other and they're 30 years old, or one person has a lot more than the other and they're 50 years old, which could change it. But you're going to have to agree on what people are going to contribute, because you also don't want the other spouse to feel like you're hoarding money to keep it away from them, or for not having a benefit of it. So you need a rational reason for why. Now, if you have a couple who maybe are comfortable, okay, and so there's some extra money and one makes more than the other, then perhaps you can come up with a percentage of your money that goes into family expenses. There's no wrong answer. It's just making sure, just like we had this conversation about me asking you about something you put on a charge card. You don't want a person to get the wrong, you don't want your partner to get the wrong idea of the reason for the method. And as long as that's open and honest, then it shouldn't be a problem. It's only like people operate so much on emotion. I don't think they always realize it, and they don't necessarily assume money's emotion, but money in some people equals power, right? And
I was just thinking the same thing, Mark. We want to make sure that if there is somebody, regardless of the reason or age, that is earning significantly more income than their partner, that event, that reality is never weaponized against their partner.
No, that's why financial issues are part of divorce, because if it's weaponized, it would ruin your relationship, right? You're going to not feel the same way about your partner if you feel like they're somehow mistreating you in any aspect of your life. And there's more than finance. I mean, children are a big issue. Intimacy is a big issue. So anytime you feel like maybe you're not being treated the way you want or not doing things the way you agreed, then there's going to be friction.
I want to thank Angie did not provide age or who was earning more money or their situation.
But you can understand why it might be a different answer based on those criteria. And people come to me and they bring up these questions and they're fine. And I kind of have the same conversation you and I are having. Like, I can't tell you what to do. I need to ask you questions about what you want to do. What's your pressure point? What don't you feel comfortable about? What keeps you up at night? It's the same thing you might ask a business owner, right? What would make you uncomfortable? What makes you comfortable? And then try to fit that within the budgets that we're talking about and the means in which you have to spend, and try to address all those issues. And at least I call it, I've used a term before in another, I call it cubby hole financing. So I think about those little cubbies that you had when you went to school and everybody put their book bag in or whatever. Well, each one of those represents a need financially, and you have to put something in each of those cubbies so you can sleep at night. You may not be able to fill them, but you have to address them. You can't leave the elephant in the room, so to speak. Whatever that elephant is financially between you and your partner.
So definitely want to thank Angie for the question, which was the impetus. Right. It was the reason why we wanted to have today's episode. But I don't want to segue off of it too quickly because it's the age-old question. So we might assume just because Angie's asking this question that it's an issue, right? And so you will see people having this discussion, let's say on social platforms. And one will say, well, I'm living in 50% of the house. And I'm responsible for 50% of, consuming, whatever we have in the household. And so therefore, I will contribute 50% and you will. And the other person will say, well, you are earning 90% of the money and I'm earning 10% of the money. So I want to contribute proportionately. And people are looking for answers. They are looking for what is right and what is wrong and precedents, right? Looking to say, this is how it is done. And so your response is so valuable, I think, to Angie, because if Angie or Angie's spouse is looking for this is the right answer, you're saying you're not going to find that externally. You need to find that internally within your relationship, and you will do something that is right. Another couple will do something that is right, and they will perhaps conflict with it. They will be two very different things. So that I think the answer that what I'm hearing you saying is that how they figure out how to fairly share their expenses needs to be something that is unique to them, and they're not going to find that answer by throwing a question on Reddit. Right? They need to look to themselves.
So, and understand something. Once you get married, all the money you earn is a marital asset. So if somebody earns 90 and somebody earns 10, if you get divorced, there's going to be an equitable distribution of that money unless it was part of a prenup. In most younger couples, it's all for one and one for all, and everything's just thrown into a basket. Maybe you have something like my son has where there's a percentage that they can keep out for their own, buying each other gifts or maybe grooming or getting your nails done or whatever's important to you. And the rest is for the family and the kids. But if you have a situation where somebody's earning 90% and somebody's earning 10 and the 90's insisting that the 10 provide 50% of the thing, you got a troubled relationship. I don't see why you wouldn't, because I wouldn't be comfortable. There may be a reason why I'm earning the 10. I'm staying home and taking care of our children. Okay. Well, then why should I be penalized? It's the old adage. You hear that, if I had to pay, what's the most underpaid job in the world? Mom. Right?
Sure, but there could be reasons why both are working 40 hours a week and one is making significantly more than the other, and there are no children in the family.
But that would have been that way before they got together. Or they would have decided that one had a certain skill. One's a lawyer and the other one is a cashier at a grocery store. There's going to be a significant economic difference between those two people. It doesn't, and if you get into a relationship with somebody and that's just start, that person who's a cashier won't become the next Elon Musk overnight, right? They're going to maybe they'll move up in the management or something, but there's going to be that disparity, and that disparity is going to exist until something changes in an event.
Right. So we're coming full circle to what you said at the top of today's episode, which is have these conversations before you cohabitate or before you get married so that you have aligned expectations.
It's not one conversation, it's ongoing. I mean, like I said, I'm married a lot of years and we still have conversations. It's not so much as much now as it's more what we want to do, like what's important to the other person. If it's important to my wife to get new lights over the sink, then should I support her, or do I feel strongly enough against it that I can make an argument about it? And not when I say an argument, it shouldn't be an argument. It should be a discussion and a compromise.
So William from Tucson. William from Tucson has started off his question with help with an exclamation mark.
Okay, well, already he should have called before.
Help.
Okay.
My wife makes way too many small purchases and I make large purchases. And between the two of us, we're spending too much money, but we're spending it differently. How do we adjust our very different spending habits?
Well, it's sort of the same answer to a different question, right? First of all, you have to get on the same wavelength of a budget, right? If you had a budget, then big items and small items would already be included in there. Additionally, it sounds to me like that William and his significant other need to have some personal money that they can spend and agree ahead of time. So, if his wife wants to make a bunch of small purchases, she can only make small purchases up to some dollar amount that they're agreeing to. And then, it's the same thing with him. If he's making large, I don't know what the purchases are, small purchases. If they're part of the budget, certainly that should be part of it. It's discretionary, then they have to figure a way of how they're going to put that money away. And so they don't feel, it shouldn't be a competition. That's another thing. Again, you'll get into well, you bought this, so I'll do that. You bought a nice car, so I'm going to buy this for the house. It shouldn't be a competition. If it gets to be a competition, it's again another point of potential friction.
We also have to be careful that it not only is there not an internal competition, but externally as well. When your family members or your friends make a purchase, that doesn't mean that you need to keep up with them and that your budget is yours alone. And you may see that other people have more material possessions. And if that happens to be important to you, you don't know how they're paying for those. So there shouldn't be a sense of competition.
Monica, that is a wonderful point. I learned this early on because I'm in a very fortunate position where I am the confidant of a lot of clients and their money. And there's a saying, the grass is always greener on the other side. It is not. Everyone has their own challenges. They may not expose them, but you and your partner should not be comparing yourself. Your next door neighbor, and you shouldn't be comparing what kind of cars you drive, where your kids go to school. People could be living in such debt and not know it, and other people could be whatever. It doesn't make a difference. It's just like you need to decide what you want to do and not keep up with the Joneses. There are all those kinds of phrases that we hear. They're very true. They're said that way because they're true. So, please, another thing is, well, they do this, so we should do that, is not a good answer for what you want. You have to, you made this earlier, you have to define what your needs are, what your personal challenges and biases are, and factor that all into what will be a limited amount of disposable income.
And sometimes, and so very true. Unfortunately, sometimes that's difficult to do. I'll give you an example. If you mentioned what school your children go to, if, the first thing that a child hears upon return, the next year in September is who went on a summer vacation and tell us what you did. And you have one child coming from a family that maybe does not have the financial means to pay for a vacation. And so they don't go on one. You have another family that does not have the financial means to go on a vacation. So they put it on their credit card. We know how you feel about revolving credit, and we all agree. We have other families that do have that type of discretionary income, and so they, through no financial hardship to their household budget, are going on a vacation. So it's hard for some people to accept that it's best long-term to do without. And so those sacrifices are hard sometimes to make, especially when you don't want to disappoint any dependents that you have.
I think that you're raising a great point. I think that we just talked about what's grass is always greener on the other side from an adult point of view. It's much more difficult from a child point of view.
Yes.
The popular girl wears designer jeans and I wear hand-me-downs. I'm being a little bit exact, but maybe what you need to point out to your children is what you might do special that maybe they don't do, that they don't see, and try and redirect, and don't try and compete. There's always going to be a little bit of competition because you want your child to feel as though they're just as important as somebody else. And it's even the same dynamic within a family. I know my grandchildren, right? She does swimming, gymnastics, so that we make sure my grandson has activities too, right? Don't have to be the same activities, but he has activities that he can look forward to where you're basically trying to balance it. And it's not a monetary point of view. It's also a comfort and a perception of that. You're making sure that you're being fair across the board. But, a lot of, I think if you listen to people who talk, some people who came from challenged economic backgrounds have an appreciation for things that other people don't. I'm not saying if somebody came from a more privileged background, they're not the same person, but you don't usually hear people say how terrible a childhood they had when they had those challenges. They may look at that as some type of what do they say? Sometimes it's funny. I think when bad things happen, in the moment you remember them, later on they become good stories. I don't mean bad things, but, travel problem or something else, or even a financial problem, or remember, as time goes on, they become follies for stories instead of the challenges they were.
And neither you nor I, I'm not a licensed psychologist. I have to be very careful that I don't say anything that is irresponsible on my part. But if you and I are just as human beings having a conversation, you can see where we're going with this. One person is much more risk adverse when it comes to their financial situation. Their spouse is more willing to absorb some risk, and there is a child in the household, and the one parent wants the child to go to school in September and say, this is where I went for my summer vacation, and the other parent is saying, I really feel that considering today's economic climate, I don't want to spend that money this summer. And considering the minors and considering the different perspectives and what makes them feel comfortable, this is why having these transparent conversations and explaining why you're thinking what you're thinking can be helpful and stop people from filling in the blanks, creating the reasons why that they're inventing themselves that may not be accurate.
Convert emotional to rational.
All right.
And I've said this before about my profession. It's not necessarily germane just to this topic, but across half my day is convincing people to do what they don't want to do, but they know they already have to do. Right. So okay. I don't know that I'm not trying to be a psychologist here, but a lot of it is talking it out and saying, okay, well, what choices do we have? What are our choices, and what choice do you want to pick? Because you're going to have choices, but the choices are going to be limited by reserves or what's available. And so it's really important to have those kind of conversations, and it's really important to make sure that it's rational and it's as opposed to emotional. A fact versus an opinion. I mean, you want it more science-based.
Right. So if you are a couple, this is, I think, a little bit unorthodox, but both in my professional life and my personal life, I think of literally everything on the likelihood and consequence scale, and this has come up in previous episodes. So if you think of things through that lens, you can weigh two different options and quantify like what would rationally be the best choice, and then you can bring emotion back into it and say, am I going to make the decision that might not be best just because I want to, and let's go for it.
Recognize it.
You can still do that, but you recognize
it.
Right.
I know this is not the best, but it's
right, but I'm doing it anyway.
Right. As long as your partner agrees or can live with it, and they get to sometimes say the same thing, it's fine.
On our very first episode, you talked about making informed decisions, and so I think, again, in the spirit of everything comes back full circle, we're seeing that consistency. So next question.
Okay.
How might a couple determine what each should feel comfortable spending money on? And how do you decide what requires a conversation versus what is someone empowered to spend money on individually? Is this a price point? Is it a category of spend? What are some different methods that you've seen?
So I would say I'm going to talk how it should be, and then we'll talk about how it usually is. I mean, if you have a budget and you're spending something that's within that budget, I don't think you really need to have a conversation. But if you're spending something that's outside your budget or contemplating something that would be out of the ordinary, then it should be a discussion. And it depends on what the discussion is. Like in my own personal life, the issue becomes cash flow, right? And it's not a matter of like, I'm really big, and I've said it before, of keeping money in checking and savings accounts for money that you know you're going to need to spend, and keeping your long-term savings in something longer term, and then having a way to handle like emergencies. So if it's going to be something that's out of the ordinary, then and since I'm the financial person in our family, it's not a matter of approval, it's a matter of understanding, so I can make sure that we have the reserves to cover whatever's being done in a manner that I have to go sell something on a day the stock market's down 100 points. So we're making good, wise monetary management decisions, not necessarily spending decisions. But to get back to your question, it depends. It has to be what you guys agree to. I mean, I think that anything out of the ordinary that somebody's going to be surprised or feel is excessive is something you need to talk about. Again, money's emotional. If you're spouse goes out or partner goes out and spends $1,000 and somehow that $1,000 would make you feel uncomfortable, or why it wasn't talked about, or 10,000 or 5,000 or 2, it could be whatever that is. You should talk about it, and you should have your own triggers of when you should have the talk. We don't need to come home every night and say, how was your day? And by the way, we have this financial agenda to get through. But you should have, about anything, what's time to have a conversation with your partner and making sure that they feel comfortable and they understand, and it's not going to be a surprise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. And when we talk about spending money, sometimes what we're spending money on is tangible. Sometimes it's entertainment. Certainly we've seen an increase in online gambling, for example. Is that a smart thing to spend money on? Do you see it just as spending money? Does it fall into the entertainment category? Does it fall into the needs, wants category? So I don't
think anybody needs to gamble.
They do not.
And if they need to gamble, there's an 800 number. So, but I think it falls into discretionary. If you have some discretionary money, but certainly I think that if that's some form of entertainment that you like, the slot machines, sports gambling or whatever, then it should be coming out of the discretionary money that you allocate to yourself. And if it starts coming out of your main money, you may have an issue and a problem.
Exactly.
You need to recognize.
So there should be some self-monitoring, right? Okay.
Right.
So to that end, I'm segueing into something here.
Okay.
I'm being sneaky. Not so sneaky. What specific systems or processes can a couple institute to manage their money effectively as a couple? How might we self-monitor?
Again, a budget is great because you're self-monitoring. I mean, if you allocate that you're going to spend $300 a week on food, and if somebody goes to the grocery store and spends $325 or $350 that week, it's not going to be a shock unless they do it every week, in which case then you're going to be over the budget amount, right?
Right.
As opposed to something else where you say, okay, well, you get $50 a month to have your hair done, and you go and have a $200 coloring job. Right. That would be a surprise to the other spouse. So I think you have this. I wish I could, because it's so emotional, it's hard to say use this one method, because the method has to be something that you matches your financial literacy. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but you're going to have your background and what you're comfortable with coming in. Maybe that's influenced by parents. Maybe it's influenced by prior relationships. Maybe it's influenced by any kind of external, your own job. Like, I'm an accountant, so I'm influenced by being an accountant. Maybe somebody's influenced by being a financial advisor. So you're going to bring those influences. There's no right system. It just has to be one in which you both understand this system and know when, and it comes out over time, when there's a violation of that system, when it's like something that needs to be talked about and not just happening. And listen, it's going to happen. I mean, there's been times in my life that I've spent money that my wife was surprised about, and she spent money that I was surprised about, and it wasn't done on purpose. It just was, well, I didn't think I needed to talk to you about it, or I completely forgot, or I didn't think you care, or whatever that reply would be. And if she cared, then I have to figure out next time not to do it again. It's like saying you're sorry means you're not going to do it again. Not you're sorry until next time. Saying
you're sorry requires action.
Right.
Okay. So I would love for those that might be listening or watching to visit onthemark.cpa. We do have one more question, Mark, but before we get to that one more prompt that I'd like to share with you, we would love for anyone who is interested in how they might self-monitor their spend to go to onthemark.cpa, because we have some tools there that you might want to use to help you keep an eye on your budget and whether you are sticking to your own budget and how you might need to split classification of a particular spend. For example, if you have budgeted $1,000 per month on groceries and 1 month you spent $1,200, you might allocate $1,000 of that to your grocery budget and $200 to your excess spend. If you are lucky enough to be able to have a dollar amount budgeted every month that is where you might have overspend gets assigned to that. What I mean by that, for example, is if your budget is $5,000 a month, each line item might add up to $4,500, and then you've got an overflow of $500 where you can allocate excess spend. And as you look at that excess spend, you might need to adjust your budget going forward, or you might need to adjust your buying habits, but I know, Mark, you are a huge fan of providing real-time consultative services and evaluating everything contemporaneously. So if you wait until it becomes a problem, you have waited too long to pivot, too long to adjust, and you've perhaps spent money that you didn't need to. So we might want to use some of these apps to make it real easy to self-assess our spending habits. Yeah?
Yep. There's some personal financial stuff you can do.
Yep.
Again, I think the most important thing is a budget. I really do. I mean, if you guys have a budget and, we talked about in an earlier episode of wants and needs, you're going to have a budget that handles all the needs, and then you're going to figure out what the wants are, and you're going to have to figure out how to divide that up, whether that's going to be in a joint account or you're going to have a certain amount of your own money discretionary the other one doesn't see, for buying them gifts or whatever works best for you.
All right, last question here. And I'll provide some context as we talk about the importance of context as to why I might ask you for your insight on this question. Is I hoped we might discuss here what impact the broader economic landscape may have on your financial decisions as a couple. For example, context. When there is more security, when there is more of a stable economic environment, one might feel more in control themselves and feel like they can spend because they understand what tomorrow is going to bring. When there is uncertainty, someone might be less willing to spend money because they're more fearful that tomorrow is going to bring a surprise. So as we talk about having a budget, having transparent and authentic conversations, to your very valid point earlier, that is not one and done. This is something that is ongoing, that will evolve and change over time, not just due to internal changes within the family, but also due to external factors that we cannot control. So could you talk about that a little bit?
So you used the word feel when you said that, right? Mm-hmm. Again, the word feel is an emotional word.
Yes.
So yes, there's going to be external factors that you don't feel, and there's an economic thing, the consumer confidence that comes out. Mm-hmm. You hear these things on, and that's kind of like a barometer of how people, a collective feel. You don't have to be part of that mob mentality, but listen, if you hear that there's been some layoffs, there's possibly going to be layoffs at your company, you're going to feel differently about spending in excess of your needs, because you might need that money when something slows down. So yes, how somebody feels, their perception of how things are external to what they even can control has a marked impact on especially the discretionary parts of their income. So, our economy is mainly based on the income, on the spending of consumers. And so when that slows down, then we start talking about recession. So why does it slow down? It normally slows down because people don't feel good about things. They don't feel positive. They don't feel like things are going well in the future. That could be a collective mob mentality, not feeling well. It could be things not feeling well in your industry or the position at the company you're at. So that would have and again, that's going to need to be a discussion of where do we tighten our belt in case? What can we defer until we're comfortable? And again, everything that we've talked about this entire episode has been based upon communication. There has to be communication. I mean, nobody can know what the other person is thinking, even somebody you may have been with for a long time. You just don't know, because you don't know that they didn't have a conversation with someone else that influenced them that you weren't aware of. And therefore, that changed their attitude, and now they need to be reset or just reassured or whatever that person might need. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of what goes on in the economy is based upon feel. If you feel good, you'll buy maybe a little more expensive car. If you feel bad, you might go look at a used car. So especially when it comes to larger purchases.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for the insight that you shared today. And we want to thank everyone for joining us. Please consider liking today's episode if some of the things that Mark spoke about today made you think about some things that you want to do a deeper dive on within your family. And please click to follow us. Visit onthemark.cpa to submit a question for a future episode. And we'll see you next Wednesday.
All content provided on this podcast is for informational purposes only. No representations are made as to the accuracy or completeness of information that is presented. On the mark, its owners, collaborators, and guests will not be liable for any errors or omissions, nor for any losses, injuries, or damages from the use of this information.